welcomes you all this evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. I've prepared a special collection of night shift stories for you to enjoy. So, sit back, relax, and let the darkness take over as we dive into some chilling tales that are sure to send a shiver down your spine. Story: The Forgotten Store. I never thought much about working night shifts in the quiet, forgotten parts of the city. The hours were long, the work was simple, and there was a kind of eerie calm that settled over the building once the sun dipped below the horizon. It was just me and the hum of the fluorescent lights that flickered intermittently overhead. I had been working at a small, run-down retail store for about 3 weeks now, and I was getting used to the routine: stocking shelves, sweeping the aisles, and making sure the cash register was ready for the first morning customers. Nothing extraordinary, just the typical night shift grind. But there was something about this place that felt off. The building, an old brick structure with faded paint and a dilapidated sign that read "Joe's Discount Mart," had seen better days. The floor tiles in the backroom were cracked, the bathroom smelled like mildew, and the heating system often groaned like an old man trying to stand up. The store was located in an industrial part of town, surrounded by warehouses and factories that hadn't seen production in years. The parking lot was always empty at night, save for a few stray cars parked at the far end. I'd sometimes catch a glance of someone in the parking lot, but they'd disappear as soon as I blinked. I was used to the solitude, but something about the place gnawed at me. It wasn't the building itself that creeped me out. It was the people who came in at night. Or rather, the people who didn't come in. The first odd thing happened on my third night shift. I was in the back, unloading boxes of canned goods from the delivery truck that had arrived earlier that evening. The air was thick with the smell of cardboard and dust, and the fluorescent lights buzzed in the silence. My only company was the occasional creak of the wooden shelves and the distant rumble of trucks on the road. I had just finished stacking a crate when I noticed a sign on the men's bathroom door. It was something I hadn't seen before, a small, handwritten sign that read, "Keep out, creep out." At first, I thought it was a prank. A typo, maybe. Why would someone spell "keep out" with a C? But there was something about the sign that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the strange spelling, it was the way it looked. The paper was old, yellowed, and the ink looked faded, as if the sign had been there for years. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just a joke, something left behind by the previous night shift workers. But then, the other workers started avoiding the bathroom. Every time I saw one of my workers walk past the men's room, they'd quickly glance at the door and then head outside to the back lot to relieve themselves. I thought it was odd, but I didn't think much of it at the time. That night, as the store quieted down and the clock struck 3 a.m., I decided to investigate. I was cleaning the front aisles when I noticed the door to the men's bathroom was slightly ajar. It hadn't been like that earlier, so I approached it cautiously. I couldn't explain why, but I felt an odd pull toward the bathroom, like something was waiting inside. My heart raced. But I pushed the door open anyway. The moment I stepped inside, I was hit with the foul stench of decay. It wasn't just the typical smell of an old bathroom, it was worse. It smelled like something had died in there. The air was thick and sticky, and the yellowish light from the overhead bulb cast long, eerie shadows along the cracked tiles. I recoiled at the sight of a fresh cheeseburger lying on the floor, its wrapper open and half of it untouched. Next to it, a 2-day-old drink sat, its contents spilled onto the floor. My stomach churned, but I had to investigate further. I looked around the bathroom. The stalls were empty, and the sinks were dry, but something about the space felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air was too heavy, too still. I had just turned to leave when I heard the door open behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. But there was no one there. The bathroom door was still wide open. And the cheeseburger was still there, sitting untouched on the floor. Confused and unnerved, I quickly exited the bathroom and locked the door behind me. I made my way back to the front of the store, my mind racing with questions. What was going on in there? Why was the door unlocked? Why the cheeseburger? And why had it smelled like death? The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something strange was happening in that bathroom. I decided to close early and leave a note for the morning shift. I wrote that I had closed early because I was afraid of something in the men's bathroom, something that didn't seem right. I figured it was best to let someone else deal with it in the morning. The next day, I was told that the bathroom had been locked for over a decade. The owner of the store, a middle-aged woman named Beth, explained to me that the men's bathroom had been out of order for years. In fact, they had blocked it off because it had been unhygienic and unsafe. No one had used it in years, and there had never been any cheeseburgers or drinks left in there. But what about the cheeseburger? And who had been in the bathroom? I felt a growing unease in my stomach, but I couldn't make sense of any of it. A few nights later, I decided to go back to the bathroom and see if anything had changed. This time, I was more cautious. I had a flashlight with me, and I wasn't planning on sticking around for long. I turned the knob and entered the bathroom, expecting to see the same mess I had left behind earlier. But to my shock, the bathroom was pristine. No cheeseburger, no spilled drink, no smell. It was as if nothing had ever happened. The floor was clean, the sinks were dry, and the walls were as bare as they had been when I first arrived. I checked the door again. It was locked, just like it had been before. But then, just as I was about to leave, I heard something, a low, muffled sound coming from the vents in the ceiling. It sounded like whispering, but it was hard to tell. I froze in place, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers grew louder. It was like someone was right behind me, whispering words I couldn't understand. I whipped around, shining my flashlight into every corner of the bathroom, but there was no one there. Just the same empty stalls and cracked tiles. I rushed out of the bathroom and slammed the door shut behind me. My mind was racing. Who, or what, was in there? And why hadn't anyone told me about the strange things happening in the store? The next morning, I told the morning shift workers about my experience. They seemed skeptical, but I insisted that something wasn't right about that bathroom. They set up cameras to monitor the area, but when they reviewed the footage, they found nothing out of the ordinary. There were no strange noises, no cheeseburgers, no drinks. It was like the bathroom had gone back to normal. I tried to leave it behind, but something in me couldn't forget what I had seen, or heard. A part of me knew that there was something deeper going on, something I couldn't explain. A few weeks later, I was scheduled for another night shift. But when I arrived at the store, something was different. The lights were flickering, and the air felt thick and heavy. I walked into the store, expecting to hear the usual creaks and groans of the building settling. But instead, I heard the distinct sound of something dragging across the floor. I froze. The dragging noise came from the men's bathroom. I stood there for a moment, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to go near it, but my feet moved on their own, carrying me toward the bathroom. The closer I got, the louder the dragging sound became. When I reached the door, I could barely bring myself to turn the handle. But I did. Inside the bathroom, the cheeseburger was back. Only this time, it was half-eaten, with bite marks clearly visible in the stale, cold meat. The drink had spilled again, and the whole bathroom smelled like something had died in it. I never went back to that store after that night. The place shut down shortly after, and I heard that it was sold to a new owner who completely renovated it. But I can never shake the feeling that something was lurking in that building, something that couldn't be explained by logic or reason. Some things, I've learned, are better left uninvestigated. Story: Shadows in the hallway. I had worked the graveyard shift at 3 different jobs, each one more exhausting than the last, but the most unnerving job of all was my time at a small, 2-story hotel on the edge of town. The place was older, with creaky floors and dim hallways that felt like they had been untouched by the sun for years. I was hired to work the night shift, primarily handling front desk duties and making sure everything was quiet during the long, silent hours. But what I didn't know was that those silent hours were far from peaceful. The first week on the job went by uneventfully. I spent my nights sitting behind the front desk, staring at the glowing numbers on the clock and waiting for guests who never came. The hotel had only a handful of rooms, and most of the time, I was the only one there, save for the occasional guest who would check in late. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. Little did I know that my nights would soon be filled with strange, inexplicable occurrences that would turn my life upside down. One night, just a week into the job, I decided to do my usual round through the hotel. The upstairs hallway was always the most eerie part of the building, narrow and dimly lit, with wallpaper peeling off in places and a faint, musty smell that seemed to linger in the air. I wasn't one to believe in ghosts or anything supernatural, but there was something unsettling about that hallway. It always felt like someone was watching me when I walked through it. That night, I made my way down the hallway, my footsteps echoing off the old carpet. It was quiet, too quiet. Just the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the occasional creak of the building settling under the weight of time. I had reached the end of the hallway when I heard something behind me. A faint sound, like someone walking softly on the carpet. I turned around, but there was no one there. I brushed it off as my imagination, maybe the wind from an open window stirring something on the floor. I continued walking, but the footsteps continued, just behind me. They were soft at first, but soon they grew louder. Someone was following me. I quickly glanced over my shoulder, but again, there was no one in sight. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the sound of my own shoes on the floor, but that didn't explain why the footsteps seemed to match my pace. The sounds began to change. The light footsteps morphed into dragging noises, like someone was shuffling their feet along the carpet. I could feel my heart rate increase, my mind racing as I quickened my pace, but the dragging sounds only grew louder, closer, and faster. At this point, fear took over. I wasn't walking anymore, I was running. My breath caught in my throat as I sprinted down the hallway, the sound of shuffling footsteps right behind me. I didn't dare look back. I reached the stairs and ran down them, nearly tripping in my panic. As I reached the lobby, something worse happened, something I will never forget. I heard it. The breath It wasn't just any breath. It was labored, ragged, like someone was gasping for air directly in my ear. And then I felt it, hot, wet breath on my skin. The kind of breath you can only feel if someone is standing inches from you. My body went cold, and every hair on my body stood on end. I ran to the front desk, crouched down, and covered my ears, squeezing my eyes shut in the hope that it would somehow make everything stop. For what felt like an eternity, I sat there, frozen in terror, unable to move. I could feel the presence above me, like someone was looming over me, watching me. Then, as if a gust of wind had blown through the room, I felt something brush lightly against my hair, fingers. Perhaps, or just the sensation of a breeze moving through my locks. But there was no breeze. There was nothing but silence. I stayed there, trembling, for what must have been at least 10 minutes before I finally dared to open my eyes. When I did, I quickly crawled into the back room, my heart still racing. I waited in the dark until the morning shift arrived, too terrified to even speak. When the manager finally showed up, knew I had to tell her what had happened, even if it meant looking insane. I risked it, telling her everything, the footsteps, the breathing, the sensation of someone standing over me. She didn't seem surprised. In fact, she told me something that sent chills down my spine. The guy who had worked the night shift before me had quit after almost the exact same experience. He hadn't lasted a full month. Apparently, it was a common occurrence for anyone brave enough to work there overnight. After that night, I refused to go near the upstairs hallway again. No matter what happened, I avoided it. It wasn't just the footsteps anymore. I started seeing things. Shadows, always dark. And quick, darting along the walls of the downstairs hallway. They moved in ways that didn't make sense, as if they were aware of my presence. Once, I saw a shadow at the end of the hall that seemed to be moving away from me. But then, it turned. Slowly. Like it had noticed me, and it was coming back toward me. That was enough. I bolted from the hallway, running straight to the back room, locking the door behind me. From that moment on, I kept my distance from any part of the hotel I didn't have to be in. The dark hallways, the empty rooms, the forgotten corners of the building, they were all off limits after hours. But things didn't stop there. There was one final incident that solidified my belief that the hotel was haunted. It happened a few months into my shift, on a night just like any other. I was sitting at the front desk, watching the security cameras when I saw something on the monitor that made my blood run cold. In the camera feed of the pool area, I saw a man standing by the edge of the water. It was well past closing time, no guests should have been in the pool area. I frowned, annoyed. We had strict rules about the pool closing, and if a guest ignored them, they would have to face me. I was about to march down there and kick this guy out when I noticed something strange. The pool was still, perfectly calm. There were no ripples in the water, no sign that anyone had been near it. I could see the sauna door was open, the bathroom door ajar, but there was no one in sight. I walked to the pool area, expecting to find a guest sneaking around. But as I entered through the only door into the area, I realized something was off. The lights were dim, and the air felt heavier, thicker than usual. There was no one there. No man by the pool. The sauna was empty, the bathroom doors open and vacant. I froze. I checked the camera again. The figure I had seen earlier was gone. I had walked through the only entrance, and no one had passed me on the way out. Panic set in. My hands trembled as I backed out of the pool area, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't even bother to lock up properly. I just ran back to the back room and stayed there for the rest of the night. The next morning, I tried to rationalize everything. Maybe it had been a glitch in the cameras. Maybe I had just been seeing things. But deep down, I knew the truth. This hotel was more than just a building. It was a place where something lived, something old and forgotten, and I was just the latest in a long line of night staff who had witnessed its presence. After that night, I handed in my resignation. I didn't even care about the money anymore. The hotel had broken me. I couldn't stay there any longer, not after everything I had seen and felt. As I left, I looked back at the hotel one last time, feeling a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. I wasn't the first person to leave after a night like that, and I knew I wouldn't be the last. But for those who remain, the hotel still waits. Still watches. Story whispers from the past. I've worked night shifts at nursing homes for years, but nothing ever prepared me for what I'd experience at Mapleview Manor. I'd heard the rumors before I even started, about the haunted halls, the restless spirits, and the old building's eerie reputation. But I never believed them. Ghosts, in my mind, were just stories told to scare the new hires. I was a pragmatist, just a nurse trying to make a living, not someone who thought spirits lingered in old buildings. Mapleview Manor was a newly developed facility, built on the grounds of a much older nursing home that had been there for decades. The town elders used to talk about it like it was a piece of local history. The old building had witnessed countless lives come and go. The new facility, however, had been promised to be modern, clean, and, most importantly, free from the ghosts of the past. Or so I thought. The first few months at Mapleview were uneventful. It was your typical nursing home. Most residents were elderly with various forms of dementia, some were bedridden, others needed assistance walking, and a few required more specialized care. My shifts were routine. I was a certified nursing assistant, working the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift with a colleague, Sarah, a registered nurse who was more attuned to the spiritual side of things than I was. Sarah had an unusual hobby. She was a paranormal investigator in her spare time. She never forced her beliefs on anyone, but she'd share her ghost stories when she thought it was appropriate. I used to laugh along, thinking they were just tall tales, until things started happening at Mapleview. Strange things. Small things at first, but they quickly escalated. It started with the lights. There were certain areas of the building where the lights would flicker for no reason. The nurse's station, for instance, was always a little dim, even when the overhead lights were on full blast. Sarah would joke that it was just the old wiring, but I wasn't so sure. One night, while I was working the desk alone at around 3 a.m., something happened that made me question my whole view of the world. The hallways were quiet, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the break room the only sound. I was reading through patient notes when I heard it, 3 knocks, quick and loud, right behind me. I jumped up, startled, and spun around, expecting to see one of the residents standing behind me. But the hallway was empty. I checked my surroundings, but there was no one. I shook it off as my imagination getting the best of me. I was working alone at night, and I was tired. But then, an hour later, the voice came. "Help me," a woman's voice whispered, right in my ear. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It was so clear, so close, that I could almost feel the breath on my skin. But there was no one there. I glanced around the nurse's station and the hallway beyond it. No one. The silence was deafening, and my thoughts raced as I tried to make sense of it. Probably just a passing resident, I muttered to myself, trying to push the fear away. I even checked the call light for any rooms down the hall, but it was silent. Maybe I'd just imagined it. But then something even stranger happened. A resident down the hall, Mrs. Blanchard, whom I'd checked on earlier that night, paged me through the call button. "Please, get me out of here," she cried over the intercom. "There's a woman screaming for help in my room. I can hear her right next to me." I rushed down the hall, my pulse racing. Mrs. Blanchard's room was just a few doors down from the nurse's station, and I couldn't understand why I hadn't heard the screams. I knocked on her door, expecting her to be confused or delusional, but when I opened it, she was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with fear. "She was right here," Mrs. Blanchard whispered, pointing to the corner of the room. "I heard her. I heard the screams." "You didn't hear it?" I checked the room, the hallway, but everything was quiet. The woman wasn't there. I felt a cold chill down my spine as I reassured Mrs. Blanchard that everything was fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That was just the beginning. The following week, things escalated. The call lights would go off in rooms where no one was awake. Residents would claim they heard voices, footsteps, or sometimes even felt something tugging at their bedsheets. One night, a new resident, Mr. Henderson, called me into his room in a panic. When I entered, his eyes were wide with fear. "I felt it again," he said, trembling. Someone was shaking my bed. I could feel it. "It wasn't you, was it?" I tried to comfort him, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I checked the room, the bed, but found nothing unusual. Still, the feeling of unease lingered. The place felt wrong. Sarah noticed it too. One night, when we were sitting in the break room, she turned to me with a serious expression. "You know," she began, "this place, it's built on land that's seen a lot of death. The old nursing home was torn down, but some of those spirits might still be here. I've heard rumors from some of the older staff. People say that after they demolished the old building, strange things started happening." I looked at her, skeptical. "Come on, Sarah. This is a new building. A fresh start. Those are just stories." But even as I said it, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off. The worst of it came one night, when I was alone at the desk again. It was around 3 a.m., and I was starting to feel the effects of sleep deprivation. The building was eerily quiet, as it always was at this time, and I was fighting to keep my eyes open. That's when I heard it. Again, this time, it was much louder. "Help me. Please help me." A woman's voice, desperate and pleading, came from the far end of the hallway. I rushed down the corridor, my heart racing, my breath shallow. I reached the room where the voice seemed to come from, room 206. But when I opened the door, I found it empty. The bed was neatly made, and the lights were off. There was no sign of a woman in distress. No one was in the room at all. Confused and terrified, I checked the nurse's station. The call light for room 206 had been activated, but no one was there. I stayed at the desk, shaking, my eyes darting to every corner of the hallway. The feeling of Being watched was overwhelming. And then, I heard it again, this time right behind me. "Please, help me." I spun around, but the hall was empty. I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to explain it. But there was no denying it anymore. Something, someone, was here. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the experience. I started researching the history of Mapleview Manor, hoping to find some logical explanation. That's when I found it, a news article about the old nursing home that had once stood on this very site. It had been around for decades, and many patients had passed away there, some under questionable circumstances. The rumors said that when the building was demolished, the spirits of the patients who died there didn't leave, they just stayed. The more I dug into it, the more I learned about the tragic deaths in the old facility. I even found records of a woman named Eleanor Blackwell, a patient who had died under mysterious circumstances years ago. The article described how Eleanor had often begged the nurses for help, claiming that someone was trying to harm her, but no one believed her. And then I realized something chilling. Eleanor Blackwell had died in room 206. The very room where I had heard the voice. I never went back to room 206 after that. The whole building felt different after that night, as if the spirits of the old nursing home were still lingering, waiting for something. I couldn't prove it, but I knew deep down that something had crossed over from the old facility into the new one. And whatever it wasn't friendly. After a few more strange encounters, I finally left Mapleview. They say the spirits of the past are supposed to rest in peace, but I learned the hard way that sometimes, they never really leave. They just wait. And when you least expect it, they whisper to you from the shadows. Hey everyone, Mort here. Thanks so much for tuning in and listening to tonight's stories. I really hope you enjoyed them. If you did, it would mean a lot to me if you could drop a like and hit that subscribe button. And if you made it all the way to the end and aren't subscribed yet, well, that'd be awesome too. I put out new videos every week, so I hope you'll stick around. A huge thanks to my amazing members and patrons. You guys rock, and your names are right there on the screen. If you like this video, I think you'll enjoy this one too, so why not give it a watch? Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.